In this video, we are going to look at non-experimental methods, case studies, and multi-method approaches. We'll be successful if we can describe what a case study is, some of the methodologies used in case studies, and some strengths and weaknesses of the case study design. We'll then look at the benefits of the multi-method approach. So case studies tend to be a more overarching non-experimental method. They complement surveys, observations, and the multimedia method approaches quite well. So a case study is an in-depth, detailed study of an individual or small group of individuals. It's commonly used in psychology to study atypical behaviours, and these are quite rare. So we've talked about the use of clinical psychology before. This is a good method to use in clinical psychology. Sachs was quite a famous proponent of case studies. He was a famous neurologist who carried out many detailed case studies, including Mr. P, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, the case of Jimmy G, who had Korsakoff syndrome and was stuck in 1945, and the twin siblings who constructed their own language and can calculate seemingly impossible mathematical problems in their heads. There's also the very disturbing and depressing case in Curtis 1977 of the little girl Genie. If you want, you can look at the PowerPoints and watch the clip associated with Genie, who was kept restrained and unable to move by her father into her early teenage years. It's very interesting to look at the development of a child's ability to make connections with other people and language and reasoning skills. As part of this, a linguist spent several years with Genie, working day in, day out, and was able to conduct interviews, experimental approaches, and several other things, and together form a case study approach. So, as I've said, there's many different methodologies you can use in a case study. You can use a case history, so these are recordings, for example, school records. So in school we have CMIS, and we have multiple other recording things, or health records. We have interviews, so the interviews could be with the person themselves, could be with their friends, families, caseworkers, social workers, teachers, etc. These can gather the attitudes, feeling, and any other evidence for qualitative design. Questionnaires are psychometric tests to assess attitude, abilities, and anything that's psychoanalyzable. We've talked about bogus pipelines and social desirabilities. So obviously there's flaws with questionnaires in the psychometric approach, but they're a useful part of a case study. Diaries of the individual, so it's an interesting window into the mind of that person. Remember, in psychology, we're not looking for a definitive answer, we're just looking to describe the situation we're faced with. And observations. So we've talked again about the flaws of observations as part of a case study, but they're useful to add to the overall body of information. And then the experimental tasks such as memory tests, fitness tests, and other such. So you could stop the video and think about the strengths and the weaknesses of a case study design. Some of the strengths would be you get highly detailed and in-depth data that is useful, easy to analyze, good ecological validity. So obviously, because you are not manipulating a lot of the variables, you're gathering quite real data, which has the ecological validity, high ecological validity. Often the only method suitable for studying abnormal behaviors or complex behaviors or behaviors that change over time, and good for investigating things within the animal design, which of course is my area of interest. Often it is the only thing that is possible to use when you're analysing complex human behaviour. Weaknesses, obviously you can't get a causal relationship between what you observe and any effects. But however, as part of a pilot study, or again when you have no other methodologies that you can use, it's a useful thing to do. You can't generalise outside that situation. Obviously if you found another similar situation, you could possibly extrapolate from your case study, but it's very difficult to have a lot of power when you're doing that. Low reliability, so a lot of case studies involve recall of past events, which may be open to different interpretations, memory distortion, or social desirability bias. Subject reactivity and lack of observer objectivity. We've talked about things like Milgram experiments, we've talked about prison experiments, and the fact that if the observer is part of the experiment themselves, they'll lose a lot of objectivity. It's difficult or near impossible to replicate, and it's very time consuming and expensive. So in the case of Genie, that linguist had to stay for years trying to build Genie's linguistic abilities, and then in the end, of course, she wasn't even fully able to do that. The important things for strengths are high ecological validity, and for weaknesses, a lack of generalizability and the fact that it's time consuming and expensive. So on page 22 of your sheets, this is what I want you to stop the video and copy. So case histories, interviews, questionnaires and psychometrics, diaries, observations, and the experimental tasks. And you can obviously add the extra information in. So in terms of the multi-method approaches, most psychological researchers tend to combine several of these approaches, so the surveys, observations, and case studies. For example, Hodges and Tizard, 1989, combined the experimental approach and non-experimental approach when looking at ex-institutionalized children. Longitudinal study, which involved an experimental approach. The independent variable was, of course, attachment experiences, so some of the children were adopted, some returned to their natural homes, and others remained in an institution, so these are things like orphanages or shared homes. A control group of children who had spent their lives in their family home was used for comparison. A non-experimental method was then also used to obtain information. The children, their parents, teachers, peers were all interviewed and when they were 8 and again when they were 16. So this is a longitudinal study with a cohort of students. So that's fairly simple. In essence, what is on this slide talking about combining several approaches, all you really need to get from this. And this slide here, Hodges and Tizard 89, is just examples of how you would do this multi-method approach. Hopefully that makes sense. We've now finished this part of the course. We'll look at data analysis and ethics in a further part of the course.